Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is the podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and I, as always, am very happy to be with you on another Tuesday with another author interview. Today I am interviewing author Kimberly Collins about her book, Blood Creek. It is the first book in the Mingo Chronicles. This book is historical fiction. It is set in the early 1900s in the Appalachian Mountains, in the West Virginia coal mines. In 1912, West Virginia starving coal miners are arming themselves and threatening to strike. Wealthy coal operators have hired the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency to protect their fortunes and crush the rebellious miners by whatever means necessary, no matter how violent. Long smoldering resentments are about to erupt into one of the largest armed insurrections in U.S. history, the West Virginia Coal Mine Wars. In the midst of this powder keg atmosphere, Ellie Klein arrives in Charleston on the arm of John Havers, a top lieutenant to Tom Felts himself. Young, breathtaking, and, as the gossips whisper behind her back, a kept woman. Ellie doesn't mind the gossip. She adores being the center of attention. She loves the parties, the fine dresses, the jewelry. This is the life she always believed she deserved. Could it at last be enough? But Ellie has a past and secrets. A husband on the run for killing her lover. A baby daughter living with her cousin back in Mattawan. A new lover she sneaks into her bed while Havers is away. And her biggest secret of all? Ellie is a spy. Uniquely positioned to know the battle plans of both sides, Ellie straddles two worlds, the sparkling high society life of Charleston and the family roots that still twine deep into the coal dust of Mattawan. Now Ellie must choose between luxury and loyalty, between escape from drab small-town poverty and love for her family. So this is historical fiction, but there is intrigue, there's a lot of stuff going on in this book, and I love that it is told from a woman's perspective, so you get a female perspective on the West Virginia coal mine wars. I know there's been a lot of books, both nonfiction and fiction, written about this time period and this place, but they aren't often told from a female perspective, and that can be very different, and we do talk about that some in the interview. Now, before we get to the interview, I do want to mention the cover of the book, because I forgot to ask Kimberly about it in the interview. We do talk a little bit about the cover and how I had some misconceptions about it when I picked it up to start reading it, because, I do so many interviews and I get so many books that I have stacked up waiting for interviews that I don't always remember what they're going to be about. And so, this was one of those. The cover is this very striking picture of a young woman walking into a river or a lake, some sort of body of water. She's wearing a white dress. Her hair is flowing down her back. And the book has kind of a reddish tinge to it, which makes sense because it is the book is called Blood Creek. But what I didn't ask Kimberly about was the fact that she says in the book that she actually took the picture that is now on the cover, and it is a picture of her niece. Kimberly says in the acknowledgments, my niece, Natalie Harmon Capel-Shaw, for being my muse for Ellie and letting me photograph you in the river, on the railroad tracks, in the creek, pretty much wherever I wanted for the cover photo. So I had meant to ask Kimberly about that, and it just slipped my mind. But the cover is very cool, and I like that A, Kimberly took it, and B, she took it of her niece, and it's this very cool picture. So let's go ahead and get to that interview with Kimberly Collins about her book, Blood Creek.
This call is being recorded.
Hi, Kimberly. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
I am very happy to have you here. We are here to talk about the first book in the Mingo Chronicles. It's called Blood Creek. Before we get to the book, though, could you share a little bit about yourself?
I currently live in Knoxville, Tennessee, and I grew up in southern West Virginia in the coal fields, which is what the my two books that I have now are kind of based in that area. I have been writing for as long as I could string two words together. And then I turned 50 and I finally got serious about it and decided that if I'm going to be a writer, I need to be a writer. And so I just took the plunge and did it.
I love that. And so you, this is not your debut novel. You have one other novel, but this is the first in a historical fiction series. Now, I have to tell you that I've been getting a lot of thrillers and horror books being sent to me for interviews. And so I hadn't really paid attention. I just grabbed the book and I looked at it, and the cover is really cool, but it's called Blood Creek, and the cover has kind of a reddish tinge to it. And I was like, oh, look, another horror book. And then I actually started looking at it. I was like, no, historical fiction. I'm so excited. So can you talk a little bit about the premise of the book?
Yeah. So growing up in southern West Virginia, there's a lot of coal mining in the area. Always has been. And I grew up in a family of miners and very pro-union people. My family's has always been very pro-union. And in the tiny little town that I'm from, Matewan, the United Mine Workers and the coal operators had a battle that was called the Matewan Massacre. And prior to that, there were other skirmishes, and the miners would go on strike, and the coal operators would send in armed guards to fight them. And so I grew up hearing these stories my entire life. And you grow up in a small town, a small union town, and it's just you just can't escape hearing these stories. And I always heard them, a very male-dominated industry, and I had always heard the stories from that male perspective. And I set out to tell the Mingo Chronicles from the female point of view, because I think it's worth a story worth telling, and it kind of gives a different perspective on these events.
Yeah, and just for people who may not be familiar, can you explain that word, Mingo?
Mingo is the county that I grew up in, so it's Mingo County, and the Mingo is actually a tribe, a Native American tribe that most people don't know about, and they many moons ago, I think they lived in that area that we now call Southern West Virginia and Kentucky and Virginia, but there are not a lot of Native American people there now, though.
Sure. That is the unfortunate case in a lot of places.
Yes.
Yeah, because I was curious because it's the Mingo Chronicles and it's Blue Mingo Press, so there's definitely it
yes.
catches your attention. So I wanted to ask about that. The main character in the story is a young woman named Ellie. Can you talk a little bit about Ellie and what you think might resonate about her with readers?
Yeah, so Ellie is a character that I think a lot of people will love to hate and hate to love. She's based on a real person, and quite a few of the characters in the book are inspired by, real people and real events and everything. And Ellie, when I started writing the book, I did not start with Ellie. And in my research, I was speaking with my brother-in-law and some of his cousins, and they were telling me about one of the characters in the book, Tom, and they started talking about Ellie, who had been married to Tom. And I was just smitten from the get-go. Ellie was a woman far ahead of her time. The book is set in 1911, 1912, 1913, and during that time, women were not heard from. They didn't really have that strong of a voice, but Ellie kind of marched to the beat of her own drummer, and she was. I don't want to give too much of the story away, but she did what she wanted to do. She was an adulteress, but she was a very strong woman. Maybe not in the ways that we would think of as being, a lovely, gracious lady, but she was. She did what she wanted to do, and she didn't care about, the norms of society. She did her own thing. And the first part of the book, I pretty much stick to Ellie's true story and her marriage to Tom, and they had a child, and they, some things happened. I don't want to give it away again. But the second half of the book, I take Ellie off into the land of fiction. But I think the character of Ellie in Blood Creek will resonate with a lot of people, in that a lot of women, that she was very strong. And she knew at that time, during, the early 1900s, that a woman's place was to, be seen and not heard. And she's beautiful, and she's smart. And I think a lot of people underestimate her and think that she's just another pretty face, but she isn't. And she uses these things to her advantage to get the information that she needs. And she manipulates and uses a lot of people. And I know that part might not resonate with a lot of people, but during that time, she used the tools at her disposal, which really were her brains and her beauty. And I think there are a lot of aspects of Ellie and her sister Jolene and some of the other female characters in the book that, given the Me Too culture now, I think a lot of women can kind of resonate with that a bit.
We are going to go ahead and take our first break of the podcast. I find Ellie to be a very layered and complex character. There were times when I did not agree with her at all, and there were times when I was amazed at her audacity and her bravery, etc. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. Something else I'm amazed with is that Ellie was a real person, and so I'm always fascinated when authors take the stories of real people and turn them into historical fiction. I know that happens a lot in historical fiction, but I just feel like I would spend so much time trying to figure out how to fictionalize this historical person, what to leave out, what to put in. I think I would spend way more time obsessing about all the details. So I am impressed when authors are able to do this and create a character that really comes to life on the page like Ellie does. So we are going to take that first break. When we come back, we'll be talking more about Ellie and the book Blood Creek. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
The GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with author Kimberly Collins about the first book in her Mingo Chronicles. It is called Blood Creek. Before the break, she was talking about the story and about the main character, Ellie. And so we are going to continue our conversation a little bit about Ellie and her role in the book. I'm glad actually that you said that she's a character that you love to hate, or hate to love, because there were moments when I was like, oh, come on, Ellie. But in the context, it actually makes a lot of sense. And we can't take our modern perspective and place it upon a woman in 1911, first off, and also in Appalachia, which is very much more patriarchal than some of the other areas of the country.
Yes.
And she really did try to utilize what she had at her disposal, which, were a big part of that was her looks. So,
yes. Right. And women, early 1900s, education for women was not a priority. And, going to school, going to college, being a doctor, being an attorney, women didn't do those things. They married and had babies and had tea parties. And that was, pretty much the end all be all for most women in that era, especially in Appalachia. And I think the real Ellie did some things that I really don't want to talk about right now, because it will come out in the next book, that she really did these things. And I just sat with my mouth open when I heard the stories. I'm like, you've got to be kidding. I'm like, in like 1918, 1920, she was doing some things that makes me blush now to think about some of the things that she was doing. But I think the entire story of Blood Creek, I tried to, at the beginning of the book, I have an author's note that kind of sets the tone and gives some context to the actual story of that time and place. And I know that coal is a dirty word now. And what I'm hoping that people will look at and just take a step back from your stance on coal and look at it through the eyes of the people who lived in the early 1900s. And, coal powered our country, and it powered the Industrial Revolution, and it gave us a lot of the conveniences that we have now and that we take for granted. And I think that the context of the story is, you can't look at it through the eyes of us today, because it was a totally different time, and people's motives for doing the things they did were very different than we would do now. So you can't judge Ellie necessarily by our society and our structure today, because it was a different time, definitely a different time for women.
Exactly.
And it's not that long ago that we got the right to vote, and I think that we really take so many things for granted in that vein, that even now we still struggle with some of the things that Ellie was struggling with. She wasn't even supposed to work. She couldn't own property. It was just a very different time.
Right. And what I appreciate about historical fiction especially is that it does give us more of a human perspective on certain time periods, as opposed to just reading, a paragraph in a history book. Here you can see characters, you can see how they're living, you can see, what it was like to live in that time and have coal be so important to the economy and, your life, even while it was killing most of the men, who had to work in the coal mines. So how do you feel that, because numerous novels have been set in this time period, in this era, but they're not always, as you mentioned, told from that female perspective, how do you feel that this female perspective changes how some of those events might be depicted?
I think, just from my own experience, always hearing them from that male perspective of what the men were doing, and they were tough and they worked hard and they were big and strong and did all these great things, and the women are never talked about. That I come from a family of very strong women, and until I got older, I didn't really appreciate that, because I never heard it. I had lived with it and I saw it, but it just kind of skews your perspective when every story you hear about the past is about the men. And that, again, just goes back to that tone of Appalachia, where it's a man's world. And I think the story can just really show the struggle that the women had and still have. You know, it's an extreme case of women, the women's voices not being heard. And I'm hoping that it just sheds some light on all the people of Appalachia, not just the women, but just to give people a better perspective of coal miners in general and coming from that culture. And, you know, they're still mining coal and they're still fighting to keep coal alive. And I personally don't know that it's ever going to come back to be the mover and shaker of the economy in that area that it was before. But I'm hoping that the book just sheds more light on the people of Appalachia and coal miners in general, so that, you know, it's an election year, and, you know, fossil fuels are always a hot button in politics. And during the last presidential election, there were so many, you know, negative things said about coal. And I'm like, well, okay, I get again, coal is a dirty word, but you're lumping the people of the area in with that. And I would just like to give a different perspective on the people and what has made these people who they are and what has shaped the place. You know, I just think that there's a sense of place there in Appalachia that is really strong with these people. And I just want to shed some light on the past so that people can get a better appreciation for Appalachia.
And again, I think it goes back to not putting our 2020 perspective on something that happened over 100 years ago, but also to read about the experiences that, you know, yes, they're fictionalized, but they're based on real facts and real events, and to know that, you know, nothing exists in a vacuum. And so all of what we know today is based on hundreds of years of history that have led up to how we experience things today. And so to put that into a more human perspective, I think is very helpful.
Yes.
And so what kinds of research did you do for the series?
Oh my, I read everything I could about the actual Mine Wars events, and there's a lot of stuff in the West Virginia archives that is online. And I had a friend of mine actually sent me some historical documents. He works at the West Virginia University, and he sent me a ton of information from their archives just to read, just historical documents. And the Mine Wars Museum was a great source of information as well. And just reading about the area, and a lot of it was from, you know, interviewing people that had, you know, family that lived during that time. So my research was all over the place, and it was a lot more intense than I ever thought it was going to be, because I thought, well, I know a lot about the Mine Wars. This should be easy. And turns out that it was a lot more digging. So because the more I kept reading, the more I kept finding, and then trying to, you know, make sure that those details were accurate. So all the events in the book that are about the actual mine wars, the coal operators and the miners, you know, their skirmishes and the sniper attacks and all those, the shootings and all of that those were very real events. And I've just sort of wrapped my characters around those events just to give through the characters' eyes. But it was a lot of research about a lot of things, and I learned things that I had never known about. Because growing up, I had actually never heard of Cabin Creek and Paint Creek. I had never heard of the strike. I didn't know that any of these things existed. So that sent me, you know, down another rabbit hole, just digging for information.
It sounds like a lot, but it sounds like fun and very interesting.
Yeah.
Let's go ahead and take our second break of the podcast. When we come back, we'll be talking a little bit more about the personal connection Kimberly mentioned that she has with the story, with her family, etc. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking with author Kimberly Collins about her book, Blood Creek. Let's return to that interview. You did mention that you have an author's note at the beginning, and you talk a little bit about your personal connection with the story. Obviously, you grew up in the area, but can you talk a little bit more about the connection that you mentioned in that author's note?
So growing up there, I had, like I said, it's Coal was king when I was growing up, and it was the only game in town. And there's not any other industry. All the other small businesses in the area all fed into coal. You know, everything was just an outgrowth of the coal industry. And when I was, in high school, it was like, 10th, 11th grade, my parents had divorced earlier when I was about 12, and my mother, the only jobs were minimum wage, and she had 4 children to raise. And so she took the training and went and applied, because it was safety training you had to take. And so she went and applied for a job in the mines, to work inside the mines. And women at that time did not do that. It was frowned upon. People laughed at you, thought you were crazy. But she just is kind of like, these men are making money. Why can't I? And so she goes and applies for the job, and the superintendent, calls her into his office. It's a small town. Everybody knows everybody. And he calls her in and he asks her, why should I give you a job in that mine when I have men with families needing jobs? And she's like, well, I'm a woman with a family and I need to feed my kids. And he basically laughed at her. And so she left. That just set a fire under her. And so she and 7 or 8 other women filed a class action lawsuit and won. And this was in like 1977, 78. So it was a time when women didn't do this. So to me, that was a very strong indication of even going back to Ellie. It's like it even so, 50 years apart, the women were still fighting for things. And even now, it's 2020 and we're still fighting for things. But that was a very strong impression with me when, I'm a teenager and my mom is out, fighting for her right to work inside of a coal mine. But everyone in my family have worked in the mines, and it's just, again, it was the only game in town. So I just grew up knowing that and living in that world. So it was a pretty easy leap for me to write about it.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's I think your mom needs a book.
I know, right? So I'm thinking eventually it will be, but it will probably be more of a memoir type thing for her,
right.
for sure. But yeah, it was some of the things that she went through, when she even went into the mine, and a lot of the men gave her a really hard time. I think they tried to scare her off, that she would, that she would quit. And my mother is beautiful. I mean, she looks like Ava Gardner. She's this tiny, petite, beautiful thing. And for her to go inside the mine, a lot of the men laughed at her, but she never missed a day of work, and she worked just as hard as any of them.
Wow, that is amazing. This is a series, so do you have a release date or, estimated release date for the second book?
I was really hoping that I could have it come out in October of this year, but I just, again, there's a lot of research to do because I want to get the facts of the mine wars correct, and I'm hoping, my plan right now is that the publication date will be probably early May of 2021.
Okay. And how many books do you envision for the series?
At least 2, possibly 3. It's really going to depend once I start writing. I know that Blood Creek turned out to be a lot more book than I initially had planned. So I'm going to estimate 3 at this point, but no more than 3 for sure.
Okay. Thank you. As I mentioned before, this is not your debut novel. You have another novel called Simple Choices. Would you like to talk a little bit about that book as well?
Yes, my firstborn. Simple Choices is it's fiction, but it is based on real events that happened in southern West Virginia. I had a young cousin who she got divorced. She had some children, and she got involved with a local drug lord. And oddly enough, in such a small little town, drugs at the time, and this was like early 2000s, I guess, he was selling a lot of cocaine and pot and just, random things. And this was kind of on the beginning of the opioid crisis. So he wasn't really selling a lot of pills, but mostly cocaine. But he was selling a lot of it. And she got involved with him. And then the FBI got involved, and the FBI wanted to know where he was getting his, who were his suppliers and where was he getting his drugs. And he was not going to cooperate with them. And so they somehow convinced her to be an informant. And the drug lord boyfriend found out about it and had her killed. He had her alleged best friend kill her. And then they buried her body and hid it. She was missing for, 3, 4, 5 months. So it's a story about, there's no happy ending, and I'm not really giving anything away. It's definitely a book worth reading. But the premise of the book is that, we all make choices every day, and you can make good choices or bad choices. And even the most simple choices that you make each day can lead you to a very, very bad end. And I think that that's what my cousin did. I think she made a decision to date this person, not realizing where the road was going to go. And then just one little choice every day just led to something horrible. And given the current opioid epidemic that's just really all over the country, I think it's a very good message for a lot of people. And I've had a lot of people who read the book that had addiction issues in the past that said, I read your book and I loved it, but I got halfway through and I just had to put it down for a few weeks because it hit home. It hit really hard. So again, there is no happy ending, but I think it's a very good message for a lot of people. And I didn't set out to tell my cousin's life story. I wanted to tell her ending as a warning bell to other people, because she was a young girl, a young woman, and it could have been anyone. It could have been any young woman in southern West Virginia.
Wow, that is an amazing story. I mean, sad, obviously, but wow, just to be able to tell that, and I'm sure there's a lot of power in that book, and to affect people like that is really amazing.
Yeah, and it was very hard to write. She was my younger cousin, and I hadn't seen her in years. And, when she was little, we spent time together. And then, I'm a teenager. I was about 5, 6 years older than her, probably. And, I go on my life and live. And then the next thing I know, she's missing. So the story was very difficult to write. And just knowing that it really happened, it's a pretty sobering story. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So are you working on the second book of the Chronicles now? Is that what your current project is?
It is. I'm working on the massacre, and in Blood Creek, at the end of it, Ellie and Jolene and a crew of people end up leaving West Virginia and going to going away. If we haven't read the book, I don't want to give anything away. But in the massacre, everyone ends up coming back to Mate 1, and then the Mate 1 massacre that actually took place is the central point of the story.
All right, it is time for our third and final break of the podcast. When we come back, we'll be wrapping up our interview with Kimberly Collins. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Kimberly Collins about her Mingo Chronicles and the first book in that series called Blood Creek. You mentioned that you have written basically your whole life, so it's obviously something that you have always wanted to do. And then you mentioned, once you turn 50, but how did you jump in and just make that transition from it being something that you wanted to do to something that you were actually doing?
I wish I had some fabulous answer to that question, but I literally, and I think it might just have a bit to do with my obsessive personality mostly, but it's something I had always wanted to do, and anything that I had written prior to writing Simple Choices, I rarely let anyone read it. And I don't know, it's like I woke up one day and I thought, if I'm going to do this, I need to do this. And a fire was lit under me, and I had been going back and forth with the Simple Choices story for a while. And I thought, I want to write about this, but I don't know what I want to write about this. And I had a lot of stops and starts. It started out as an essay, and then it was a short story, and then I thought, I'm just going to write this as fiction. And I literally just woke up one morning and dove into it head first, and I did not stop writing. I just wrote until I was just like a crazy woman writing. And I don't know. I think you just reach an age where you realize that time is like a liquid in our hands, and it's just passing by so quickly. And I have a dream, I have things I want to do, and I'm just going to put everything else aside and do it. And I'm still doing it. I can't, now that I'm this, 2 books in, I can't imagine not writing. I can't imagine stopping writing and not ever doing this again. I think this is just what I was meant to do.
Mm-hmm. So out of that, go ahead.
I was going to say that sometimes life gets in the way, and you have so many distractions in life. And I think it takes, for me anyway, it took time and just being of a certain age to realize that, wow, I'm 50, and I don't. And I still, in my head, I'm thinking I'm 25, right? Except, maybe for my knees, but I'm like, I don't know where all the years went, and the next 50 are going to go by just as quickly. So I just need to get on it and do the things I know I need to do the things I know I'm supposed to do.
Mm-hmm. So out of that experience, then, would you have advice for aspiring authors?
Start, and don't be afraid of doing it. And, I had a career. I was working when I was younger and traveling for work, and just very caught up in all of that. And I have no regrets. I wish I had had been more serious about writing earlier, but my advice is just do it and don't waste time. You just have to not allow yourself to be distracted by all these things. But yeah, just jump in and do it.
Mm-hmm. And when you take time to then read for yourself, what are your favorite genres or authors?
Oh my goodness. So I'm my reading pleasure is all over the place. I love nonfiction. I'll read anything by Malcolm Gladwell. Love him. I love Stephen King. I can't get enough of Stephen King. And I can read anything from Stephen King to Tennessee Williams. I don't have a favorite author, but there are some people that will write something, and I definitely will pick it up and read it. But I just started The Third Rainbow Girl by Emma Eisenberg, I think is her name, and that seems to be pretty good. It's about Appalachia, and I last week finished a book, The Long Bright River, which was very similar to Simple Choices. It was a drugs and murder and all those sorts of things, and it's fiction. Fabulous book, just a fabulous book. Great writing, great story, very, very on point to the subject matter. But I don't have a favorite author. I think I read so many genres. I'm just all over the place, and I absolutely adore young paranormal fiction. And I don't know what that is. It's like the young adult paranormal fiction. I could read it all day long.
Thank you. I know you have a website, so if you could tell people what the website is and where they can interact with you on social media.
Yeah, the website is bluemingopress.com, and I'm on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you just go to my website, you can find links to each of those. So all my social media.
All right. Thank you so much. We've talked about a variety of topics, but is there anything that we haven't covered that you were hoping to mention in terms of the series or writing in general?
No, I think we've covered pretty much everything.
All right. Well, I want to thank you again for joining me for the podcast. I really appreciate it, and I love that you're taking kind of personal, things that are very close to you and creating this series of historical fiction. I really appreciate that.
Well, I hope everyone likes it. I'm hoping that it gives a different light to Appalachia. I don't think there are enough good stories written about Appalachia, and I just want everyone to see the beautiful Appalachia that I do.
I agree. And thank you again for joining me.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you once again to Kimberly for joining me on the podcast and talking about her Mingo Chronicles series, especially book 1, which is now out. And I am looking forward to the next installment of the series to find out more about Ellie and more about what happens next in her life. It does become, as Kimberly mentions in the foreword, that it does become more fictionalized in terms of what happens to Ellie after this first book, but a lot of what happens to Ellie in this first book is based on actual facts and events. So I love historical fiction, as you know, so I'm excited for the rest of this series. Thank you, as always, to you, my listeners. If you would like to win a copy of Blood Creek, it's very simple. All you have to do is go to our social media pages, Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, and comment on this post in the next week, sometime in the next week. So that would be, February. Oh my gosh, next week is February. So February 4th. If you comment by February 4th, I should actually pull up a calendar instead of just trying to figure things out in my head. If you comment on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter by February 4th, you will automatically be entered to win a copy of Blood Creek by Kimberly Collins. So comment on the post with this episode 210, interview with Kimberly Collins, and tell me your favorite historical fiction novel or series that you have read on, as I said, Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, GSMC Book Review. Speaking of social media, you would help us out a lot if you could follow us on social media, like our posts, retweet, share, do all of those lovely things that help us, especially if you can subscribe to the podcast. And if you could give us a 5-star review, that would just be the icing on the cake, the bee's knees, whatever euphemism you want to put in there. Thank you so much for that. And thank you, as always, for tuning in and joining me for another episode of the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I hope you're having a wonderful last week of January, and I hope this week involves, as always, time for you to get lost in a good book.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.